Multicam, or multi-camouflage, a design that's been around for the better part of 20 years now. With early versions created by the United States-based company Crye Associates in conjunction with the US Army around 2002, it was originally intended as a new universal camouflage pattern that would minimize the number of designs, but also help to, in a way, usher in a new era of uniforms, equipment, and gear going into the 21st century. However, that didn't quite happen, as the design was ultimately rejected, at least for a time, as the Army went with the Universal Camouflage Pattern, or UCP. Not discouraged, Crye continued on forming its commercial wing, Crye Precision, while also making the now recognizable Multicam available commercially and even to other armed forces around the world. Though slow to catch on in some ways when compared to the digital camouflage boom of the mid-2000s to mid-2010s or so, today the design is everywhere, constantly expanding and evolving, and many, when hearing of a new country or armed branch adopting it or a variant of it, will usually react somewhere along these lines.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.
But regardless of where people fall on that spectrum, Multicam is here to stay and will likely only continue to broaden in the years ahead. So that being said, there's numerous variants of it worth exploring as well as comparing. Now, as far as variations go, there's really a few different ones for a few reasons. Unlike digital patterns, many of which share quite a few similarities, Multicam can be pretty distinctive due to either the shapes or color groupings. However, that hasn't stopped them from seeing their colors change slightly or greatly, as well as shapes adjusted too in order to give them a level of distinctiveness for an assortment of reasons. So what this means is that variants within the greater Multicam family fall into one of four primary categories. Ones that are reminiscent of the original design, which see very little to nothing changed about them, ones that share the same or similar colors as the original but greatly alter the shapes of the pattern, those that bear the same or similar shapes but significantly change their colors for environmental, unit, or symbolic-based reasons, and finally versions which alter both the shapes and colors for the same aforementioned reasons, but overall are still close enough to resemble the original design. This means a few avenues can be looked at, but for this video, we'll stick with the first category, as even though some variants see minimal changes, the stories behind them can actually be quite interesting. With that, let's start with the baseline by taking a quick look at the original Multicam design, but before that, we've got to thank the sponsor of this one, Venture Surplus. If you're in the market for US gear, look no further, as they have a huge assortment of pieces, especially of the modern variety, and the best part is they take the time to list everything in great detail. Want a US OEF-CP FRACU, but also a standard or flame retardant OCP top, along with true spec OCP trousers? Don't worry, everything's clearly labeled and described. You can literally go through their inventory and see and read about the differences between similar items. Whatever you end up doing or getting though, remember to use the coupon code HISTORY10 at checkout to get 10% off of your order. But with that, let's dive into some Multicam. Now, technically the Multicam we all know and love, or detest, is not the original design, as it saw some tweaking between its initial unveiling and becoming available on the commercial market. But since its introduction around 2004, the finalized pattern consisting of 7 colors has really only seen official modifications in the form of environmental recolorings named Multicam Alpine, Arid, Black, and Tropic, as well as contracted variations on national levels. As far as these go though, the original, still known as just Multicam, remains the dominant variant, being made in uniforms and other pieces by Crye Precision itself, as well as other companies by way of licensing. So here's something of a comparison that shows official Multicam on both ripstop cotton as well as flame retardant fabrics, though made by a few different companies. First up is a US Army Operational Enduring Freedom Camouflage Pattern, OEF-CP for short, flame retardant Army combat uniform, which was arguably the most common uniform during the stopgap period that saw the licensing of Multicam, which was dubbed OEF-CP, between their UCP and eventually standardization of the operational camouflage pattern. Next is a commercial copy of the ACU produced by Proper, which officially licensed Multicam for it. This specific one is marked Multicam VS, short for Visual Spectrum, which technically is something of a variant as it's not NIR compliant. And finally is a top that could be considered a prime piece when looking at Multicam, as it's a Crye Precision made second generation Army custom field shirt, which has seen a bit of use with assorted Special Forces units such as the Air Force Pararescue, as well as SERE members and Army Rangers, to name a few. But anyway, throw up a cross section of the pattern close up for these, and you can see how differences in garment type, fabric, year of production, and manufacture can result in slight differences between the color shading. To show this a bit more, let's throw up a swatch of the Aircrew combat uniform and Jungle Army combat uniform, both of which also saw Multicam used. So naturally, commercial pieces, be they made by companies like Proper, True Spec, Emerson, Helicon Tex, 511 Tactical, and so on, or contracted ones by others, can see slight differences, but overall the camouflage remains the same, seeing 7 separate colors and transitional areas between some shapes, with its pattern orientation being dominantly horizontal, though with a few vertical elements. But let's now get into the fun stuff with a few different international versions, by starting out in the Eastern Mediterranean with the island nation nation of Cyprus. Gaining independence from Great Britain in 1960, over the next 15 or so years, Cyprus saw quite a bit of political upheaval due to Greek and Turkish influence. However, in 1964, its armed forces, known officially as the National Guard of Cyprus, was formed, seeing three branches: the Navy, Air, and Ground Forces. Between then and the early 2000s, the camouflages used by them were heavily influenced by Greek designs, predominantly in the form of copies of their lizard patterns. Around 2003, they would adopt their first original camouflage, which could be argued as something of a hybrid amoeba woodland type one colored for a more arid environment. Occasionally referred to as sandstone, it would primarily be seen printed on BDU-style uniforms, seeing minor variations and changes over the years, such as shading differences and the addition of the National Guard seal into the design. From there, small instances of other patterns were observed, mostly worn by more specialty units. But it wouldn't be until the mid-2010s was the decision to update their primary patterns seen. In 2014, the General Staff began a project to modernize their uniforms and equipment, which would also see the introduction of a new camouflage. After about 2 years of studies and trials, a pattern was settled on, which was more or less a copy of Multicam, as two main patterns that were looked at were the US Army OCP as well as the British multi-terrain pattern, both of which had connections to the original Multicam. This design, which often is referred to simply as multicolored camouflage, was a 6-colored pattern that was planned on being made in a more modern uniform cut, which according to some sources said improved the fabric quality and colors for concealment purposes. As with many other nations, the plan was for the pattern to begin issuing with Special Forces units before slowly being cycled in while phasing out older designs. In 2017, select infantry units were given these new uniforms for the October 1st Independence Day Parade, with plans to bolster that number the following year in something of a grander spectacle that in turn would essentially jumpstart the transition across the board. However, come September of 2018, a handful of news outlets began reporting that around 30,000 uniform and accompanying pieces, enough to equip those in the parade and then some, were unsuitable and did not meet the standards as set out in the production contract. Ideas were floated on how to go about solving the issue, with suggestions that only officers wear the rejected uniforms just for the parade, but this idea was rejected too, instead opting for either older uniforms or hastily acquired temporary ones sourced locally. This unforeseen setback more or less delayed the rollout by about a year, but by the summer 2019 conscript induction event, new uniforms which met the requirements had been sourced and issued. Since then, the design has more or less taken over as the standard pattern for the Cypriot National Guard, though it seems smaller pieces of the older designs such as helmet covers still occasionally appear. Now, as far as these rejected early pieces, specifics weren't quite spoken about regarding what the factors were. However, based on pieces dated around that time, a good theory was the camouflage print itself. Here are two recent Cyprus pieces in the new design. On the right is a more standard field uniform, which is heavily inspired by the US Army's first generation ACU, while on the left is a heavier field coat. Looking from afar and just at the garments themselves, you can see a nominal difference in shading, which could be excused as standard since these were likely produced differently due to them being two separate pieces using different fabric. However, if we look much closer and side by side, you can actually see how substantial the differences are. On the left here is the coat's pattern, while on the right is the field uniform. Quite noticeably, the colors from the coat are majorly different, being much brighter overall while only featuring 6 instead of 7 shades. Typically with multicam variants, these shapes frequently see a sort of diffusion gradient effect in some areas to help break them up, some of which can be seen on the right field uniform version. However, with the coat's pattern, this effect is seen much more, and with the mid-brown sections looks almost as if the ink for them was running low, resulting in an almost non-solid dotted effect. Though this is just a hypothesis, looking at the tags for each of these, the coat's one shows a date of 2017, while the field uniform is 2021, which lines up well with the timeline of events. Both garments are contracted by Cyprus-based firms, though are outsourced to Chinese companies, which isn't a surprise as many newer sandstone pattern uniforms saw the same thing. But that out of the way, let's do a quick comparison between their version and the official Multicam. When it comes to the shapes, it's pretty much a direct copy, seeing a few distinctive ones. However, they overall are a bit bigger and almost chunkier in appearance, but the biggest change is the shading, as it's a tad darker and a little more muted throughout. That said though, it's now time to hop northward to Ukraine, which has seen its fair share of multicam garments, though arguably its most consistent uniformed usage isn't through its armed forces, but rather through law enforcement. Ukraine has seen ongoing fighting in its easternmost region since 2014, though has been dealing with Russia's direct invasion since 2022. It's quite a bit of a story that doesn't really have to be rehashed here again, as it was covered in full in our video on Ukraine's search for a standard camouflage pattern. To say the least though, since 2014, all sorts of camouflage patterns have been fielded by Ukrainian forces, be they officially issued donated, or privately sourced, meaning it can get a little messy, especially when it comes to Multicam, as there are so many commercial copies, variants, and so on. We're not getting into all that though, but rather looking at an officially issued one used by the National Police of Ukraine, which itself falls under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which was established in 2015 as a part of reforms brought about to help stop corruption within law enforcement agencies, while also trying to give a new positive perception for the general public due to the long-standing history of its predecessor, the Militia. Existing in one way, shape, or form since 1919 throughout the Cold and post-war eras, this unit and its subsequent specialty branches and detachments essentially was a national police force, but was also under the control of the KGB, leading to numerous questionable acts against certain groups of people. After the Cold War, the Militia remained, seeing some minor changes, with the most notable being it ending up directly under the control of the Office of the President. However, violations, corruption, and crime continued. However, in 2014, with the Maidan protests and subsequent revolution, things finally came to an end come November of 2015, when any remaining Militia officers were transitioned over into the newly formed National Police, once they passed the new requirements. Since their formation, they have seen numerous subdivisions, forces, and units broken up by region, city, and speciality, which in turn has obviously led to quite a few different uniforms being employed. Because of this, camouflage uniforms have also been seen often with more specialty units that relate to more tactical or direct engagement operations, seeing patterns ranging from smaller scale and less common examples to more widely seen and worn ones. This was compounded when Russia initiated its invasion in 2022, as afterwards a renewed emphasis was seen with establishing and mobilizing national police officers to the front lines to bolster troop counts. Sometimes referred to as military units of the National Police, much like their counterparts in the Armed Forces, National Guard, and so on, its forces utilized a mix of officially issued, privately acquired, or donated gear. Among this sea of different patterns and cuts, though, is a specific officially produced and issued uniform bearing Multicam. Sort of. Referred to simply as Special Suit, the specifications for them were approved in 2020, with initial contracts for them coming the following year and production runs going into early 2022, like this one, which is dated February. From there, initial pieces began to be seen sporadically, picking up a bit more in the months after the invasion, with even more produced seemingly through accelerated contracts, with certain tags having ones referred to as emergency situations, likely to get more uniforms into the hands of officers who could find themselves in direct and active conflict situations. Because of this, plus a mixture of manufacturers, there seemed to be a substantial level of variance when it came to their actual camouflage pattern. The initial specifications for these had them made in dark blue, khaki, and camouflage, which later on denoted it as Type Multicam. When looking at these uniforms between contracts, a lot of them see the same features but often with nominal differences. For example, these two, which are dated only 13 months apart, have slight variances with the hook and loop material, nylon bands, and plastic components like buttons and buckles. But the glaring difference between them is obviously the pattern itself. The colors are vastly different, with one having a much darker green shade, while the other is more yellowish. On top of that, the shapes within the two are noticeably different as well. But to best showcase that, let's throw Multicam in the middle to compare and contrast. The darker green version, if anything, looks closer to that of the US Army's OCP rather than Multicam. As though it has the right number of colors, it seems to have more of a horizontal orientation, with its shapes appearing smaller and shorter overall. As for the yellow dominant version, it copies many of the same shapes, though they are slightly different, seeming a tad more blotchy, though the design does feature 6 colors rather than 7. Now, these are just 2 examples, and there seems to be a few more out there, with more recent ones actually looking a bit truer to the original source. As mentioned earlier, these factors can be caused by differences between contracts and companies producing them. However, within the specifications sheet, it stated that everything must be followed properly, but also that color replacement is allowed with the consent of the customer, which likely meant the colors, or in this case camouflage designs, could be altered only if given the approval by the government beforehand. It is also stated that they must tonally match or be harmonized with the primary fabric color, which these more or less do. So at the end of the day, these are the same camouflage uniform, but with allowable differences likely brought on by external production and wartime factors. Moving right across the front lines, the third country we're looking at is actually Russia. Much like Ukraine, its armed forces, especially those fighting in the war, see quite a variety of uniforms, gear, and equipment, with a good share of them being multicam related. This has caused a bit of confusion between the two sides, leading to the usage of colored armbands. However, the primary camouflage used by a large portion of Russia's units remains its EMR, which is an abbreviation for Единая маскировочная расцветка, or in English, Universal Camouflage Colorway. A temperate digital pattern composed of tiny pixels, it began development around 2007 and appeared on early uniforms the following year, before getting wrapped up in a controversy related to the uniform's designer and issues pertaining to lacking proper quality, comfort, and protection from the elements. Over the next few years, a series series of changes were seen, eventually leading to a multi-layered all-season uniform system, initially referred to as VKBO, but now VKPO. Seeing some problems along with a few changes and upgrades since then, in 2023, new and more specified iterations of this uniform system began to make their way onto the scene. Known as VKPO 2.0 made by BTK Group, VKPO 3.0 Mod 2022 made by Triada-TKO, and a lesser-seen VKPO 4.0 produced by 5.45 Design, these systems, which were designed by Kalishnikov Concern Group in conjunction with the Ministry of Defense's Clothing Department of the Department Resource Support, took feedback, input, and preceding issues brought up by troops, a number of whom were now in direct and active combat, and addressed and rectified them while also tailoring each system for more specific units and operations. The initial plan was that these would be reserved for more specialty units such as airborne troops. However, as field testing of prototype versions were put through their paces in Ukraine during 2022, it was determined the systems would be rolled out on a more general level. Now, there's a whole story behind the VKPO systems, their differences, the confusion and hearsay regarding materials and production processes between the companies, shortages of EMR fabric, upgraded models, like 3.0 to 3.1 for example, going back to EMR by way of parallel production, and even EMR-M, a new experimental version of the older pixel pattern, and of course where this multicam clone fits into everything. It's enough to make your head spin and is worthy of its own video, or rather videos. But luckily, if you want to see more dedicated coverage of these, be sure to check out Red Ivan Military right here on YouTube, as he's done a fantastic job breaking down these systems and their continuous updates and changes in a few different videos. A link to his channel can be found in the description. Anyway though, one of the biggest things that was considered when developing these new and updated systems was obviously concealment. In interviews with officials when talking about the systems and camouflage, they acknowledge that the greener EMR works well in the summer and early autumn periods, but when the weather begins to get colder in the later autumn and winter months, the pattern begins to stick out a bit more. Additionally, with an increase in urban warfare among villages and regions with more earthen and muted colors, the green is a bit more noticeable. Because of this, with these new systems, a new pattern was developed. Kind of. Referred to by producers as Multicam, but more frequently shortened to Multique by troops, though it bears a striking resemblance to the original design, it is actually a tad different according to official statements. The original design was taken into account, however was not selected, as a heavily influenced one was developed, which factored in the terrains and dominant colors of many areas troops were actively engaged in, such as Ukraine's southern steppe region. Now, the uniform that's been showcased thus far is the BTK Group produced 2.0 summer field set, consisting of a combat shirt, field shirt, and trousers, which is more or less a base layer, meaning its usage is likely broader, which in turn means it is likely being produced in larger numbers. However, 3.0 also has a field set layer too, but the pattern's colors are different, and like said before, between manufacturers and items, there is a bit of variance between them, which has led some to speculate the sources of the fabric and where they're manufactured. But apart from that, take a look at the pattern. Shape and color-wise, it bears a striking resemblance to the original Multicam, having the same number of colors and most of the same shapes, which are scaled up some, and like many of the others seen before, are on the blotchier side. It's important to bring up that this isn't Russia's first foray into using Multicam, as apart from special forces sporadically using them over the years, as well as select forces acquiring it through private and commercial means in Ukraine, the pattern has also been seen on a decently large scale with certain FSB units, though again, these are frequently copy designs rather than officially licensed pieces. Finally, mentioned just briefly a little earlier, these newer systems have since seen a few updates to them, with many also being made with the EMR design, which has had many wondering if Russia is going to fully and permanently switch over to the Multique design. But that leaves us now with one final country, which is pretty close to Russia, as it in fact borders it: Georgia. Located south of Russia's Caucasus region, along the eastern portion of the Black Sea, we find ourselves in the country of Georgia, which after its secession from the Soviet Union in 1991, took no time in restructuring its armed forces, as it in fact even began doing so even before its independence, which would soon find itself splintered and fighting not only in a civil war until 1993, but also against the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both of which were looking to break away, resulting in the two gaining a level of autonomy. Dealing with lingering political, economic, and social repercussions through the remainder of the decade and even into the 2000s, the troops of the land forces, air forces, and National Guard would more or less use what they could get, which often came in the form of a variety of former Soviet and even Russian camouflages before phasing in US-inspired ones in the 2000s, most notably Woodland or Three-Color Desert, with the latter seen more frequently abroad during War on Terror and peacekeeping operations, which extended into the 2010s with copies of Marpat, and even UCP. However, after a period of souring of relations between Russia and Georgia, Russian troops invaded to back up separatist forces in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which had recently seen certain groups attacking Georgian positions, in August of 2008, resulting in a 16-day-long war which broke out, ultimately seeing a Russian victory. It was at this point Georgia realized it needed to put a renewed emphasis on rearming as well as modernizing its military. Over the next few years, the defense forces saw a bit of restructuring, an influx in spending, newer vehicles, weaponry and supplies, and a new focus on training, coordinating, and generally aligning themselves with NATO and Western powers. Now, though the country has been involved in a number of peacekeeping missions abroad in the years before this, the rising tensions with Russia led to a number of troops being withdrawn. However, after the war, an influx was sent to Afghanistan to continue its efforts that began in 2004. As mentioned just before, for the most part, the patterns at home were more temperate designs like Woodland and Marpat, with US 3-color Desert abroad, but this wasn't always the case, with a chunk of these already being produced within Georgia, mainly the Marpat clones, though quite a bit of it too was also supplied by the US as a part of the Georgia Train and Equip program and Georgia Sustainment and Stability Operations program, both of which were seen through the 2000s before the war with Russia. Though these were primarily focused on helping Georgia get up to a standard to assist abroad, these too helped bolster their armed forces overall, with further programs coming post-war. However, by that time, stocks of US-supplied garments were running dry. And so with this renewed effort in the Middle East, as well as US-supplied uniform stocks being exhausted, a decision was made to look into a new camouflage pattern, one that could be issued sooner to those deployed. Beginning in 2009, an increase in forces sent to Afghanistan was seen, with it reaching its peak around 2012 with some 1,500 troops throughout the country, seeing operational duties range from combat and patrolling to advisory and training over the next few years. In addition, troops slowly began to be equipped with a new uniform bearing a new pattern, which greatly resembled Multicam. For a time, it seemed that these may be just reserved for units deployed abroad. However, in 2013, it was announced by the Ministry of Defense that the process had already begun of creating new uniforms for all Georgian forces that took the feedback of those in Afghanistan and adjusted if needed, put greater emphasis on quality and construction via newer production methods done in-country and meeting NATO standards. And granted, this process took a bit of time. From reports and video, it seems by 2020 most uniforms and gear had been standardized and were being produced inside the country. However, taking into account the early uniforms, there looked to be a few differences in the cut of the uniform and color of the pattern, though the apparent finalized version of the field uniform was one that took inspiration from the US Army's first-generation ACU, which boasted a multicam variant that had something of a darker appearance. Viewing the pattern, the shapes again are mostly the same, though overall nominally thinner, while some appear to be adjusted slightly, with others recolored. As far as shading, the color overall looks to be a bit more temperate, with greens and browns seeming darker, while the more transitional elements are a little more stark. Additionally, there's a bit more white overall, with even grays being incorporated into it. Now again, there's likely a bit of variation between years, manufacturers, and batches, as is the case in most instances, but even still, the look overall differs this one quite a bit from the original Multicam. Now, it is worth noting that with every country shown here, there obviously is going to be a bit of variation with their own uniforms due to the previously mentioned factors. It's even the case with official Multicam pieces made or licensed by CRY, seen at the start. But what is worth noting is that in a lot of these instances, though these patterns are produced or at least contracted in the country, the fabric may sometimes be printed elsewhere or sourced through more than one company, meaning shade and in some examples, like Ukraine's, shape differences. As is the case with most camouflages and countries, you'll see a variety of manufacturing methods, and even the best and most strict policies can still even see some color differences. As always with these videos, let's throw up a nice full side-by-side of these to get a good comparison to show that not every multicam out there is exactly the same, and even the ones that fall into the category of direct clones with their own stories and alleged testing and development phases can even be noticeably different, at least up close. Additionally, the pattern has also lived up to its name in many places, proven here by Cyprus and Georgia by cutting down on assorted camouflage patterns and uniforms, meaning less work and more uniformity, which can be seen as a good thing concealment, financially and logistically speaking, but on the opposite side of the same coin, it could be argued as being a bad thing, as it results in nations and or specific units losing a level of uniqueness and identity, which in some cases, like Ukraine and Russia, can result in battlefield confusion with potentially deadly consequences. But anyway, that'll wrap up this one. We've really only seen the tip of the iceberg that is Multicam, and we'll certainly be taking more in-depth looks at other variations and usages in the future, be they in more comparison type videos like this one, or fully dedicated ones. Many thanks again to Venture Surplus, and if you enjoyed this video and found it informative, do feel inclined to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. If the mood doesn't strike you, that's all good. Just be sure to make your way back soon for more videos right here on Uniform History.